Yeah, we want to thank everyone for joining us. We're excited to welcome you to the first presentation in the 2021 UCLA Getty Conservation Conversation Series. And this is a series that takes place on the last Friday of every month, where we will be inviting guests engaged with different roles within the conservation community to share their exciting research or their special projects with us. So today we have the wonderful Gurmeet Raj joining us in the middle of the night. So we thank her for her time and her patience with us. She will be discussing her work conserving the Rajbagh Silk Factory in Srinagar, India, and reviving a historic craft industry. Her work connects memory and material culture to reimagine and build a better future.
Before we hand it over, I'm just going to give Gurmeet's quick bio. Gurmeet Rai is the director of the conservation consultancy firm CRCI, which is the Cultural Resource Conservation Initiative. She is an architect with specialization in heritage conservation and management. She is among the first generation of conservation architects in India and has undertaken projects across the country related to conservation, to architectural conservation, management plans for World Heritage Sites, urban conservation and development strategies for historic settlements, sustainable cultural heritage tourism plans, and the preparation of advisory and policy documents. Gurmeet was awarded the Award of Distinction by UNESCO under the Asia Pacific Architectural Heritage Awards in 2002 and 2004, and she has served on the jury for over 15 years since that time. In 2011, UNESCO appointed her as the lead consultant for the preparation of the cultural heritage policy for Punjab. She has also undertaken international assignments in Nepal and Myanmar and has been an advisor to UNESCO in the heritage sector in several countries in Southeast Asia. She is currently a member of the steering committee of Terra 2022, the World Congress on Urban Architectural Heritage, which is supported by the Getty Conservation Institute. And with that, I hand it over to Gurmeet, and I hope you all join me in welcoming him with a warm round of applause.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank UCLA and the Getty for inviting me to share a project very close to my heart today. And without taking any more time, I will now share my screen to start the presentation. Like the title already shared with you, the project that I specifically chose to share this particular project with you at this forum because I do believe that conservation of in cultural heritage space is a constantly evolving discipline, and the paradigm is shifting because it is the understanding of heritage in the context of sustainable development, in the context of making the world a more peaceful place for everybody, a more humane world, and culture can play a very important role in that aspect. This particular project, Conservation Revitalization of Rajbagh Silk Factory in Srinagar, is located in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is the northernmost state of India. And it's nestled, it comprises the most beautiful mountainous region, the Himalayas. And it's one of those places that when you go, you really don't want to come back, or you want to visit it again and again. But unfortunately, it's had a very, violent recent past. And so this project is like a beacon of hope to the communities associated with this particular factory. And the reason why I call that is the reason why I call it connecting memory and material culture towards building a future, because I do believe that heritage conservation and the practice of the way we as professionals engage with our cultural heritage sites, heritage can play, the processes that we kind of put in place can actually bring a ray of hope for people who otherwise may be in a state of some sort of distress. This project is funded by, it's a project of government of Jammu and Kashmir, and it is funded by the World Bank and was conceptualized as part of a program called the Jhelum Tavi Flood Recovery Program. So the Kashmir Valley had faced a very, a severe flooding in the year 2014. So other than addressing irrigation projects and water management projects, this particular factory was identified as an important project because it was severely impacted by the floods. And the brief that I got as a consultant was to look at the conservation and revitalization of this factory, not just its built heritage, but not just its built fabric, but also the silk as a legacy of the people of Kashmir. Yeah. So to explain the context of this particular factory, I'd like to, one can position the legacy of silk of the valley with the Silk Road. So you see in this particular map, the map of India with several of the routes, and up along the northern, edge of the tip of the Kashmir, you see the Silk Road here. And there were several roads that are actually trading routes that would go across the subcontinent and connect with the Silk Road. So there were roads towards the western part of India, though it wasn't called India at that point, and the northern part, and it touched Srinagar at that point. And the reference of silk as a legacy of the valley is there in literature and historical documents of the place dating from the 7th century. To the right, the map that you see is actually shows the various districts of Kashmir, where farmers and the tribal communities actually do the silk rearing, the silk cocoon rearing, which then kind of provides the raw material for the silk textile, which is produced at the Rajbagh Silk factory. The region of Kashmir has a very complex system of water. You have this wonderful, one of the 5 rivers of the region, River Jhelum, that flows through the valley, and Srinagar, where the factory is located, is right in the, at the heart of in the middle of the course of the River Jhelum. And also what you see in Srinagar is a very interesting system of lakes and canals and, backwaters, which kind of gives it a very unique natural heritage, a natural landscape. To the right is this map of Srinagar, and this is where you see the part of the meandering part of the River Jhelum, and the river flows from south to north, and the historic city is towards the northeastern part of River Jhelum, while the Rajbagh Silk factory is to the southern part of, when the river is flowing from east to west. Unfortunately, the way the way human beings have developed their cities, rivers, we've played a lot of, I don't want to use the word havoc, but we've really, human interventions have actually regulated the natural flow of the river. So about 100 years ago, this part of the river was kind of contained within these embankments, and the floodplain is where a large amount of development took place. And the silk factory is located to the southern part of the river, which is contained within the embankments. And I particularly talk about this because that has a huge impact on the building as well. The factory was a much larger parcel of land, which kind of sat, with an edge on the embankment of the River Jhelum. But over the years, parcels of land have been cut out from that larger factory, and many other government offices have been built, which of course has turned out to be, it's a compromise to the integrity of the factory. So as consultants, when we were appointed, we have just this particular part of the factory to work with. So this is the place from where one enters the complex. I mean, you kind of drive, this is called the Silk Factory Road, which is along the edge of the river. And then this is the forecourt with the showroom and a mosque, a community mosque here. And then you kind of move into these are the three factory buildings called Block A, B, and C. While Block A has been recently rebuilt into a modern two-storied structure, the brief that we had for our conservation project was that of restoring and retrofitting the Block B and C along with the adaptive reuse as part of the revitalization program. It's also important to note here that Kashmir Valley lies in the zone 5 of seismic sensitivities. So it's actually one of the highest, most vulnerable parts of the region, susceptible to very acute earthquakes. And the last earthquake that was experienced in this region was that in the Kashmir part, the part of Kashmir, which is part of Pakistan. And it was in 2005 that they experienced a very, very huge, a severe earthquake, which all has had an impact on the building. So like we all undertake our, are required to assess the condition of the site and the building. So we kind of were very mindful of the fact that the recent flooding of 2014, the earthquake of 2005 were two important milestones in the, which impacted the health of the building. And those were, so when we were actually trying to understand the decay, we mapped the condition of the building as a pre-2005, repairs and the condition of the fabric before that. We could see some impact of 2005 earthquake. So we kind of documented a layer of information on what all would have happened post the kind of repair works that would have been done post the earthquake of 2005. And then the other layer would be that the repairs that have been done to the building post 2014 flooding. And it was very easy for us, in fact. I mean, now it seems more easy than it was when we did it, is to understand that what was the impact on the building purely by the action of the earthquake, and what was the impact of the floods on the building, to be able to see that how robust, though simple, but how robust this industrial heritage is of Kashmir. Now, this is a very important slide for me to share with you, is that, like I mentioned, that our brief was that we need to also look at the revitalization of the silk industry in terms of the productivity of the industry. And the way we understood it, because this work that I'm sharing with you is a work of a multidisciplinary team, which comprised textile technologists, people who work with a fashion designer who works with slow fashion. So literally from farm to fashion, works with artisans and so on in terms of, though in the area of cotton, but that entire approach of looking at, the legacy of a particular community in textiles and their creative expression. So we decided to map the value chain of the way the silk production happens. And it was very important for us to understand that how there are three areas, stages of which goes into making of silk textile. And that is, the first bit is farmers who actually do the cocoon rearing. The second part is that of reelers who actually make the yarn. And the third area is that of making the textile. We also realized that Kashmir has a very rich tradition and a very live tradition to handicrafts. And I'm sure people, you're familiar with the pashmina shawl, the kind of embroidery that they do on pashmina shawls. And related to that, there are several other techniques which is related to embroidery and thread work. And done by both women and men of the valley. We also saw that there are a lot of institutions that are either working in the area of design development, but not interconnected with each other. We realized that while that's the Department of Sericulture works with farmers in terms of assisting them in the production of cocoons, whereas the area of reeling the thread, the yarn, is largely done by the private sector, while the fabric, the textile production is done by JK Industries, which is again a government body. So you have three different, kind of silos and very different stakeholders, from the most vulnerable to, the other end of the spectrum in this particular industry. We also, when we were talking to people, just as an anecdote, we would say, okay, what do you identify with Kashmir in terms of other than pashmina shawls? And they would say, we would get the answers that it's the silk carpet. And then we kind of did a little bit more inquiry into that, what makes the silk carpet special. But we were quite amazed to find out that while there are GI indicators for the silk carpets that are produced in the valley, the yarn that is used for the making of the silk carpet are not locally produced. In fact, the silk that is used to make the Kashmir silk carpets comes from other parts of the country and possibly from China. And 60 to 70% of raw silk, the mulberry silk produced in the valley, was actually leaving the valley unprocessed and going to different parts of the country for production of textiles and so on. So, we thought this was a huge gap, and the need to plug this gap, that how government, through policy and programs and incentives and technical expertise, enhancing the capacities of the weavers, more specifically the reelers, we need to, for Kashmir artisan to actually get value for this asset or the tradition that they have. They need to be able to make the thread and use it in the valley, and be able to sell the finished product outside the valley. And that would be one important way of enhancing the livelihoods of the people of Kashmir. And there are a lot of nuances related to this aspect, which there's a short film at the end of my talk, which would give you insights into all that needs to be done or can be done, how material culture, material heritage gets linked with the intangible heritage of the valley, and how livelihoods can be enhanced from revitalizing this particular tradition of the people. So this table here, this particular diagram on the left-hand side, actually, all the pink boxes are the areas which we identified needed to be strengthened. Another area that we identified that required to be strengthened was in the area of certification of the yarn that is produced in the valley. And this is critical for the silk yarn of the valley getting global recognition, because right now the certification is not adequate. So there are lots of little areas in the chain that need to be strengthened. And we strategize that how Rajbagh Silks could become the brand and for the silk of the valley, and how conservation of this particular building and revitalization of the factory should keep this very much as an important aspect, which as part of their vision statement. And in terms of revitalization of the factory, we saw this as a three-pronged approach, that what I have explained to you is basically the aspect related to culture-led approach. The second aspect would be related to industry-led approach, which is what do you do in Rajbagh for the textile that they produce and so on. so that the industry kind of gets strengthened. And the third prong would be that of a tourism-led approach, because Kashmir is one place which is kind of very popular as a tourism destination, and how this creating the demand and awareness about this particular asset of the valley would go a long way in, they all kind of, all the three prongs actually converge towards benefiting the local community. Now, looking at the building itself, these were some of the images which kind of show the kind of problems the building faced when we started working on it. The first part of our project was in 2017 when we scoped the work, and the second part of it was last year in 2020 when we commenced our work on this entire strategy for its revitalization. So cement concrete flooring, which was a later addition with a lot of wet patches, a lot of water ingress in the masonry due to damaged roofs, later interventions of paint, but more than that, out of plain masonry, which was the impact of the earthquake because there were cracks around, in the stone masonry. And then, of course, vegetation. Documentation of the decay is, again, something which all professionals are familiar with, that this is how we kind of measure. So we developed this entire legend for condition mapping, then further correlating that with the kind of conservation intervention that is needed to be able to address all of these needs. A unique aspect about this particular area is that the water level is very high. And like I mentioned to you, that the building has been historically built in the floodplain of the river, which of course is the first mistake, but that's what, and here we are to try and find solutions for it. The well, there are two wells in the site, and these are in these red circles here. And the water that you will notice is just about a meter or half a meter below the existing ground level. And this impacts the health of the building to a large extent. But interestingly, in spite of this water level, whether it has been the floods in the last 100 years or 90 years or earthquake, the building has been able to withstand all of these very, very severe, problems. This particular section, actually, we were looking, this is an investigation into the foundation, and we just kind of dug about 70 centimeters and found the water puddle here. So we kind of realized that managing water is a very important part. Reusing, using the water of the wells for the industrial work is important, but it is also equally important to ensure that we do not overdraw the water out of the ground, because that could create a certain kind of imbalances and create stresses in the building. The roofing system is that of all these timber trusses sitting on timber beams, which sit on timber columns with very shallow foundations. Site studies which kind of explain, we kind of understood that where the water logging takes place and how this part of the factory does not have any drainage. It was only after the flood of 2014 that the Irrigation and Flood Control Department has installed several of these independent pumping stations to pump the water out of this Rajbagh area. But that does not address the problem of water logging of the factory itself. The reason being that any kind of precipitation, whether it's the snow or the rains or whatever, there is no scope for water to percolate into the ground because of its very high water table. So this would be something which is very much part of the conservation plan, is how do we manage water and work with the elements of nature to achieve a good work environment for the people. This particular section shows the level of the river and the reason why the water table is so high, because here's the river Jhelum with the embankment, and this is the ground level of the factory. So when the water level of the Jhelum rises, laterally the water level in the ground of the factory also rises. So that was the reason why in 2014, when the river flooded and and the water went over the embankments into Rajbagh, even when the water level receded, Rajbagh sat like a saucer, holding all this water for 4 weeks. And the kind of devastation that had happened to the factory, it lost most of its machines, and I mean, you hear most interesting stories from how the workers put together, assembled 10 of these looms to be able to operate them and continue with the functioning of the factory. And they did that with very, very minimal resources. And they kind of say that, look, that's the pride of Kashmir. How could we just sit at home while the factory sat like this? So for several years, people had been working with just about 10 machines, which have now been upgraded under this particular project. So the conservation plan, actually, on one hand, we looked at our focus was that of livelihoods and the legacy of silk. On the other hand, was that we need to achieve a very resilient, we need to work with a framework which kind of makes the whole factory complex a very resilient space for workers and for the property, in terms of its working. So to protect lives, ensure functionality, and improve capacity were 3 important verticals that we just kind of developed, this framework that we developed towards developing the conservation plan. So building safety, undertaking assessment, to be able to do structural retrofitting, infrastructure retrofitting was one of the verticals. Safety of our occupants in terms of the operational safety, with safe fire safety, safe workstation, secure hazardous materials, and evacuation planning was as a work environment. Contingency plans to ensure functionality, so capacity building of the people who work within the factory complex, and to have the standard operating procedures to be able to address all contingencies. And of course, improve capacity, culture of safety, capacity building of the staff, and capacity building of the managers. So this is what the nature of disasters that the factory needs to address through the, the conservation planning. So in terms of interventions to make the building more robust, and later as part of the work environment, this is something which we found was missing, that there was no continuous seismic band below the trusses. And that is something which has been recommended by our structural engineers, that this is something which is critical for the safety of the building. The other part is that because the trusses are not tied to each other, so we're introducing these clamps and galvanized steel wire ropes as cross bracing. And the whole idea is to do very minimal interventions and achieve a robust outcome. In the adaptive reuse plan, very briefly, because I'm mindful of the time, we looked at the first, well, like I said, was it's an industry-led approach. And that was that the factory should be able to function as a very, kind of good work environment and efficient work environment for the workers. So while the looms are installed on the first floor of a newly built building, the pre-loom processes are going to be housed in this building C, and the post-loom processes related to dyeing and for finishing and are going to be housed primarily in half of the central building. All the wet uses require things like boilers and the STP, the sewage treatment plant, to treat the wastewater so that it would not contaminate the groundwater. Currently, they don't have that system. So the entire wet areas, the wet infrastructure is in this part of the building. So the one courtyard is primarily for the industrial use, whereas the other courtyard is related to the uses, which I will come to in a minute. The northern part of the central building is where we have housed the design center, because we realize that this is what the role that Rajbagh can critically play. based on the assessment of the value chain, there are certain areas which need to be strengthened through policy by the government, through funding, and that needs to go into its respective verticals with other departments. But what JK Industries could provide is a design center where designers from across the country, across the world, get an opportunity to work in the valley with, experimental, with new types of yarns, textiles, embellishments, and such like. And so this design center is for prototyping has been proposed within the factory complex. And this has been very well received by several people, including the workers and even the government. The floods of 2014 demonstrated that how vulnerable the factory was to fire, to, even as far as the machinery is concerned, all the electrical equipments and so on. So a grid has been introduced below the truss line, below the beam line. These are modern interventions in the building so that in case there is any rise in the water table or a minimal amount of, water into the site, at least the site should be safe from any, major accidents. So to be able to house this particular grid frame, there are these grade slabs which are being introduced, not in the entire floor of the building, but just continuous beams on which this metal framework would be positioned. And this would also lend a certain kind of strength to the building itself. A social zone has been provided because currently there are no dedicated spaces, social spaces for women. A particular part has been carved out purely for women as a common space. We have proposed a cafeteria, a canteen for the workers, which can double up as a cafeteria for the visitors. An amphitheater has been proposed under a beautiful chinar or a tree here, which is a maple tree, which is a very grand tree here, so that this becomes kind of an environment for the workers, which is, adds quality of, life to their, workspace. And of course, the mosque. Even as far as the visitation for tourism and for retail activities, if tourists and visitors and local people were to, they do come to the showroom. The objective here would be that they should be able to go into the factory complex, and a designated area is where they get access to be able to come to a garment exhibit area, to be able to walk on the periphery and see production of samples, and to get a tour of the factory of certain areas, use the cafeteria, get the history of the silk, legacy of Kashmir in the context of the larger subcontinent, along kind of an interpretation wall here. And even the factory hours are, the factory shuts at about 4:30 in the evening. So the evenings can even be used for cultural activities for the youth, for the young people, and for the workers in, this, of course, is just a detail which kind of, a particular solution that we are trying to work on, that how we can drain the water from the, the subfloors so as to protect, to reduce the water logging. This detail, for those who may be interested, that how we are introducing this grade slab, which is a 1 meter wide slab, which connects all the timber columns without really intervening, and none of the frames, the metal frame that we are introducing does not touch the timber frame structure. So the historic timber frame structure works independent of the new intervention, because we do not want any new stresses to be introduced into the structural system of the building. This is the last slide, which kind of shows the pathway for vehicular access for risk preparedness, looping around the central building, because with the kind of limitations we have with the site due to the loss of, the extents of the earlier property, we cannot get it back. but it becomes, I mean, it's very important for us to ensure that with the minimal that we have, that the risk response is disaster management and risk preparedness is kind of adequately addressed to achieve this very resilient environment for the factory and the workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Gurmeet. As you mentioned, there is an additional video, so I will go ahead and post that. For anyone who has a question, as Isabel has posted in the chat, feel free to drop that into the chat, and we'll ask it at the end of the Q&A. So I will switch over to the video.
रेशम, जिसे वस्त्रों की रानी भी कहा जाता है, अपनी विविधता और अद्वितीय शोभा के लिए विश्व स्तर पर विख्यात है। जम्मू और कश्मीर में रेशम से बने वस्त्र समृद्धि का पर्याय माने जाते हैं। साथ ही ये रेशा हजारों लोगों के लिए आजीविका का मूल स्रोत भी है। 7वीं शताब्दी में लिखे हुए जुआंग ज़ेंग की यात्रा कथाओं में रेशम उद्योग की विरासत की झलक मिलती है। साथ ही ऋग्वेद, मनुस्मृति, रामायण और महाभारत जैसे हिंदू धर्म ग्रंथों में भी रेशम का उल्लेख मिलता है। रेशम उत्पादन के इस परिदृश्य को और आकर्षक बनाने का श्रेय पहले सुल्तान जैनुल अबिदीन बुद्ध शाह को जाता है और उसके बाद डोगरा राजा महाराजा रणबीर सिंह और महाराजा प्रताप सिंह को जाता है। तकनीकी उन्नयन और पुनर्गठन ने रेशम उत्पादन की बढ़त में महत्वपूर्ण योगदान दिया। इसी समय राजबाग सिल्क फैक्ट्री की स्थापना की गई, जिसमें लगभग 60,000 लोगों को रोजगार दिया गया, ताकि विश्व भर में सबसे ज्यादा सराहे जाने वाले गुणवत्ता युक्त रेशम का उत्पादन किया जा सके। वर्ष 1937 में राजबाग सिल्क फैक्ट्री नामक एक और कारखाने की स्थापना की गई, जहां वॉपिंग, थ्रोइंग और बुनाई जैसे प्रीलूम कार्य तथा पोस्ट लूम के अंतिम कार्यों को और विकसित किया गया। वक्त के साथ साथ जम्मू कश्मीर के रेशम उद्योग को भी कई उतार चढ़ावों का सामना करना पड़ा है। हालांकि आज भी राजबाग रेशम उद्योग के विस्तार के लिए कई अवसर प्रस्तुत करता है। ये रहे इसके कारण। भारत का रेशम उद्योग ग्रामीण और अर्ध शहरी क्षेत्रों में लगभग 9.18 लाख लोगों को रोजगार प्रदान करता है। विश्व भर में रेशम उत्पादन क्षेत्र में चीन के बाद भारत का नाम दूसरे स्थान पर आता है और भारत ही एकमात्र देश है जिसके पास सभी 5 ज्ञात वाणिज्यिक रेशम के उत्पादक होने का अनूठा गौरव है। पिछले वर्ष ही एक तरफ जहां प्राकृतिक रेशम धागे, रेशम के कपड़े, कचरे और कपड़ों के निर्यात में कमी दिखी, दूसरी तरफ रेशम के कारपेटों के निर्यात में दुगनी वृद्धि देखने को मिली। वास्तव में जम्मू कश्मीर की घाटी से प्राप्त रेशम से बनाए गए कारपेट विश्व विख्यात ईरानी कारपेटों का कड़ा मुकाबला करते हैं। घाटी की अनुकूल जलवायु परिस्थितियों की बदौलत इस क्षेत्र में विभिन्न प्रकार के प्रोटीन से भरपूर शहतूत का उत्पादन संभव होता है, जिससे अंतर्राष्ट्रीय मानकों के मुकाबले उच्च गुणवत्ता युक्त बाइवोल्टाइन रेशम का उत्पादन किया जाता है। यही समय है जब हमें जम्मू और कश्मीर के रेशम उद्योग के सफल होने की शानदार क्षमता का उत्तम प्रयोग करना चाहिए। जम्मू और कश्मीर के जिला आधारित ककून उत्पादन देखें तो पता चलता है कि रेशम उद्योग में वास्तविक आजीविका और संभावित आजीविका बढ़ाने के अवसर वर्तमान है। रेशम कोकून उत्पादन से सीमांत आदिवासी, बकरवाल और गुर्जरों जैसे हाशिया के समुदायों को अत्यावश्यक आजीविका प्रदान की जा सकती है। इससे इन समुदायों की वन भूमि पर निर्भरता को कम किया जा सकता है। इन समुदायों को आवश्यक बुनियादी ढांचा, प्रोत्साहन और प्रशिक्षण प्रदान करने से इनका उच्च विकास होगा। वर्तमान उत्पादकों को स्टाइफलिंग यूनिट, प्रशिक्षण और क्षमता निर्माण के रूप में बुनियादी ढांचे की आवश्यकता है, जिसकी पूर्ति वर्ष 2016 तक केंद्रीय रेशम बोर्ड प्रदान करता आ रहा था। रेशम की मात्रा और गुणवत्ता दोनों को बेहतर बनाने के लक्ष्य को पूरा करने के लिए बाइवोल्टाइन रेशम के विषय में अनुसंधान और विकास लाभदायक सिद्ध होगा और साथ ही इससे पालकों का जीवन स्तर भी बेहतर बनेगा। रील्ड रेशम के उत्पादन को प्रोत्साहन देने के लिए कुशल कारीगरों के लिए एक समग्र समर्थन व्यवस्था का निर्माण आवश्यक है। वर्तमान कोकून बैंक के रिवॉल्विंग फंड को फिर से भरना, जिससे रीलर एक बार के निवेश के बजाय किश्तों में कोकून की खरीद कर सकेंगे। जम्मू कश्मीर की घाटी से 60% से अधिक कोकून अपरिष्कृत रूप में बाहर भेजे जाते हैं, जिससे बाइवोल्टाइन रेशम के अमूर्त मूल्य कम हो जाती है। अधिकतम आर्थिक लाभ प्राप्त करने के लिए कोकून को बनाए रखने और प्रसंस्करण तथा उत्पाद विकास द्वारा कच्चे रेशम की मूल्य वृद्धि की आवश्यकता है। राज्य में स्थानीय रील्ड रेशम की मांग को बढ़ाने से सीधे सीधे रीलरों पर इसका सकारात्मक प्रभाव पड़ेगा। कश्मीरी रेशम कारपेटों के साथ जुड़े जीआई ट्रेडमार्क का लाभ उठाने की आवश्यकता है। कारपेट के लिए रील रेशम का प्रयोग कश्मीर घाटी से एक वैश्विक ब्रांड के निर्माण में योगदान देगा और कश्मीरी रेशम कारपेटों पर संभावित निवेशकों का भरोसा बढ़ेगा। जेकेआई में औद्योगिक रेशम वस्त्रों के उत्पादन के लिए 2 यूनिट हैं। एक यूनिट जम्मू में है और दूसरा श्रीनगर के राजबाग में। वर्ष 2020 में स्थापित जम्मू की यूनिट रेशम वस्त्रों के औद्योगिक उत्पादन स्तर में वृद्धि के अवसर प्रदान करती है, उत्पादन की पारियों को दुगना करके, जबकि कश्मीर घाटी में स्थित राजबाग यूनिट उत्पादों में विविधता लाने के अवसर प्रदान करने के साथ साथ घाटी में विश्व स्तर पर जाने माने कारीगर कौशल आधार को ब्रांडिंग भी प्रदान करती है। यान बैंक के माध्यम से भारत के उद्यमियों के लिए रेशम यान प्रमाणन और तैयार रेशम धागा उपलब्ध कराना, समर्पित गुणवत्ता परीक्षण द्वारा धागे के परीक्षण से रेशम का मानक सुनिश्चित करते हुए बाद में सर्वोच्च उत्पाद देने की परंपरा कायम कर सकता है। धागे की रंगाई के लिए रंगाई की व्यवस्था, धागे के विकास के नए और नवीन तरीकों की खोज करने के लिए कारखाने का अपना डिजाइन सेंटर, जिससे नई संभावनाओं को जानने की क्षमता बढ़ेगी। डिजाइन केंद्र में परिधान निर्माण, कढ़ाई, परिसज्जन और दूसरी कौशल आधारित गतिविधियों के नमूने प्राप्त करने की सुविधा भी उपलब्ध होगी। NIFT, CDI और स्कूल ऑफ डिजाइन के सहयोग से यहां अध्ययन की व्यवस्था भी की जा सकेगी। इस डिजाइन केंद्र के पास प्रशिक्षण प्रदान करने और क्षमता बढ़त के लिए हस्तशिल्प और हथकरघा विभाग जैसे वर्तमान संस्थानों का सहयोग प्राप्त करने का अनोखा अवसर होगा। राजबाग की कहानी द्वारा उसके विश्व विख्यात उत्पाद को प्रस्तुत किया जाएगा। राजबाग के अंदर डिजाइन विकास, उत्पाद विविधीकरण, नवाचार और ब्रांड निर्माण की सुविधाओं के माध्यम से राजबाग की संस्कृति और उसके कार्यों के लिए मजबूत आधार का निर्माण संभव होगा। भारत की मुख्यतः कृषि अर्थव्यवस्था के सामाजिक आर्थिक विकास के लिए इस उद्योग में निवेश करने के विचार को सबसे उचित माना जा रहा है। आखिरकार भारत के मजबूत इतिहास ने भारतीयों के जीवन और उनकी संस्कृति के साथ रेशम को बुन दिया है।